Good afternoon, NCRGEA members, and welcome to today's webinar, Navigating the World of Caregiving, presented by our partner Transitions Life Care here in Raleigh. I'm your host, Tom McCullum, and today we'll be joined by Dewan Kelsey, Transition Life Care's Associate Director of Education. Before we begin this webinar, I want to go over a few items. This webinar will be recorded and is posted in our YouTube account later. Links for that posting will be sent to you as well as posted on our webpage. We'll also send out an email to all of you with the links and announce it on our social media sites. Each of you has been muted to help ensure the presenter can be heard. For those of you who sent us questions, we'll submit them to Dwan, and most of them will be answered during today's presentation. If you think of a question during the presentation, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom page. We'll try to respond to you during the webinar, but if not, we will read the questions at the end so that Dewan can respond. And finally, we will also be posting questions through our poll feature during the webinar that you can answer. We do this to help emphasize important points and help add focus to what we're saying. There's a link to our survey about today's Lunch and Learn presentation in the chat window. This gives you a chance to give your ideas on how we can make the presentations better and cover topics you want to know more about. We'll also be including the link in our email to you later today. NCRGEA's Executive Director, Tim O'Connell, normally gives an update on our activities at this time, but he's at the General Assembly working with our elected officials on a bill concerning elders. I don't know the details, so please don't ask. On his behalf, I'd like to bring up events that our district community advisory boards are coordinating. These events are held to help bring our members together and keep you all informed on important items. If you have a suggestion on what your CAB can do for your district, please reach out to your CAB. You can find their contact information on our homepage under the Districts tab. Yesterday in District 4, which is basically centers around Durham County, nearly 50 people attended a tour of the Bennett Place, which was the site of the largest surrender of Confederate forces during the Civil War. This action effectively brought the military operations of the war to an end. We highly recommend going there, and it's just outside of Durham. On June 12th, District 3 is holding an event at the Second Harvest Food Bank in Winston-Salem. Also in the 3rd district, they are holding monthly lunches known as Forsyth Lunch Cruisers for members so they can meet with each other. Tomorrow, May 9th, is the first one, and it's being held at the Golden Corral by the Haynes Mall, and it starts at 11:15. Also tomorrow, we're holding a local community outreach meeting in Chapel Hill. Another one will be held in Goldsboro on the 15th, and on the 17th, we'll be holding another meeting in Lenore and again in Salisbury on the 23rd. Also let you know our offices are going to be closed on May 27th in recognition of Memorial Day. And lastly, we're in the planning stages of this, so more to follow. We'll be in Charlotte on either September 10th or 11th for one of our large conferences. Like I said, we'll get more information out to you about that. You can find information about all of these events and more on our homepage under the Events tab. And Patty just posted that link for you so you can see what it is. Now I'd like to present Dewan Kelsey with Transition Life Care.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Tom, and thank you for the invitation to share a little bit of my knowledge about the world of caregiving. So I appreciate the opportunity and look forward to this discussion and those that will come after this discussion. So next slide, as we talk about the navigating the world of caregiving. This is illness and dying in the United States. And we have a patient here that's asking the wizard, do you have anything that stops the aging process? The wizard replies, sure. What kind of disease would you like? The purpose of this slide is to kind of highlight that the longer that we live, and we know that we are living longer and longer, there's the greater chances that we will experience a disease or an illness, and that we probably will need caregiving. Next slide. Caregiving, and I'll read this from Carol Levine, who has written a book called When Illness Always Turns Families on Call into Caregivers. And she quotes, "During my 9-year odyssey, I stopped being a wife and became a family caregiver. I date my rite of passage into the role of family caregiver to the first day of my husband's stay in a rehabilitation facility. A nurse stuck my husband's soiled sweatpants under my nose and said, 'Take these away. Laundry is your job.' The underlying message was that my life from now on would consist of performing an unrelieved series of nasty chores." So, for those of us who have been a caregiver or may be in the middle of caregiving, does this relate? And I will be very transparent, as I was the caregiver to my own parents. Um, and I remember taking sold, I remember just tasks that were never ending tasks. So then I kind of forgot, my role actually changed during that time. But this is a book that was written in her own words. And so I will definitely encourage you, if you have an opportunity, to take a look at Carol Levine's work. And she's done other work besides being an author, but she really talks about her experiences as a caregiver. Next slide. So these are facts about caregivers, and these facts go back to 2020. And I'll just highlight some of these. Most of caregivers in the United States are females. About 75% are females. Females are currently employed, married with children, and they work outside of the home. On an average, caregivers earn about $35,000 a year. Financially, about 78% of caregivers report that caregiving costs between $7,000 and $10,000 out of pocket. 26% of these caregivers report of being financially strained from just being able to caregive. So I want to just provide these numbers so that we can understand where we are as far as caregivers overall in the United States. Next slide. Let's do a poll first. So the first poll: which group provides more caregiving in the United States, females or males? We'll take a few seconds for you to make a choice. Okay. Have we tallied? That is correct. That is correct. So approximately 75% of caregivers in the United States are females. Very good. Next slide. Let's talk about the impact that caregivers have. More numbers, and I'm just showing the numbers just to kind of so we can put it into perspective of the impact of caregiving. So 60% of caregivers actually show signs of depression. 55% of them report of skipping doctor's appointments themselves. So they always have put themselves behind being a caregiver. 58% say that they actually do not exercise or have worse eating or exercise habit. And the level of stress can take as much as 10 years off of a caregiver's life. There's a lot of work that is around caregiver burden, a lot of research that talks about the impact that caregiving has on individuals. And so a lot of these numbers, and there's additional numbers that actually we can actually break down to say how many caregivers, the percentage of caregivers that actually have experienced a heart attack, a stroke, or even death during their time of caregiving. So caregiving is it is crucial, but navigating that caregiving and how do we do it in a healthy way is even more important. Next slide. So the caregivers report, this is the impact is what the research has shown, but caregivers report sleep deprivation, poor eating habits, failure to exercise, failure to rest, even when they're ill, and postponing medical appointments for themselves. And so I place here, does that sound familiar? Again, those of us that have been caregivers, those of us that may be experiencing caregivers at the moment. Next slide. But we're in denial. About 7 in 10 people in the United States will need long-term care at some point after the age of 65. That length of long-term care is about 3 years. But only 24% say that they're going to need it. And so at some point, what this leads us to know that at some point in our lives, most of us will serve as a caregiver. Next slide. So this is the before and after look. The before is, I am happy to serve. The after is, what did I just do? And so these emotions can vary. So the time frame before the before and the after can be days, weeks, months, and for a lot of people, even years. As we stated in the previous slide, the average length of time, long-term care, is about 3 years. But I will offer that in our individuals that are living with dementia, with the diagnosis of dementia, we know that caregiving for those individuals can last greater than 10 years, 10 and 15 years. So the before picture, but oftentimes this is the after picture. So how do we support during in the interim, but that people do not look like that or feel like the cartoon indicates as they're going through this journey of caregiving? Next slide. This is the face of caregivers. And as you can see, all ages, all ethnicities, there's no socioeconomic status here. A caregiver is anyone, and there's not a particular face of a caregiver. You'll be surprised who's really taking care of family members. Next slide. And this is where we go into who is a caregiver, who identifies as a caregiver. I ask a question, does this sound familiar? Oh, I'm just here to sit with her on the weekends. Oh, I'm just the one who make the meals 2 days a week. Oh, I'm just the one who comes in. Well, the true definition of a caregiver is a person who tends to the needs or the concerns of a person with short or long-term limitations due to illness, injury, or disability. So one, I think what happens is that we minimize who we really are as caregivers. So it doesn't matter the length of time that you may be spending with that individual or what you may be doing or attending to, you can still fall under the category of a caregiver. And I think a lot of times, and I will say this in my experience in hospice, I find that females tend to do this a lot more than our male counterparts, because we do say, well, I'm just here to do this. I only come on the weekends. But if you are tending to the needs or the concerns of a patient or of a person or a loved one, it does not matter. You are considered to be a caregiver. And so because of that, the same attention needs to be applied to you as well. And we'll talk about what that attention looks like a little later. Next slide. So when we look at the trajectory of illness, I only place this slide here to indicate where we typically fall. So this is where we typically fall when we talk about illness. And so the trajectory begins with a chronic illness, meaning a heart disease, diabetes, it could be a cancer, a type of malignancy. And then as time progresses, that chronic disease then turns into a serious illness. From that serious illness, it can progress into terminal illness. And then from terminal illness, then we grief comes. Now, I will say this again, I work in the field of hospice. And so grieving actually begins really somewhere between the intersection of that green and blue. Between, and it could even be prior to that, but I'm just for illustration purposes, I will say somewhere between the chronic disease and the serious illness, because people can go through a lot during that time and a lot of loss. During that time, it could just be the loss of employment, the loss of being able to go to church every Sunday, the loss of being able to be as social as I used to be, the loss of not being able to sit outside or enjoy activities that I used to be because I'm in that stage. And so the purpose of the trajectory, to illustrate the trajectory of illness, is to also indicate that caregiving begins in all of these stages. And it doesn't necessarily have to begin in the terminally ill stage. We find that caregiving begins in the chronic disease state as well. Next slide. So when we talk about the trajectory of disease, I wanted to kind of bring to focus, what do we have as we are moving through that trajectory from chronic disease to the loss, to the actual loss of the transition of the individual. We have advanced care planning, we have palliative care, we have hospice, and we have caregiver support. And we're going to go over real briefly each of these in the next slide. Advanced care planning. What is important to people as they face life's end? What does that look like? One way to do this, and I don't want to I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this because I do want to navigate through the world of caregiving, but I think it's important to note of the other options that are important as we're navigating through this journey that's called caregiving, and to know what's out there. So advanced care planning is important. How do we have these conversations with our loved ones or whomever we are caregiving for to talk about what's next? Tell me what's important to you so I can make sure that I honor that. I want to honor that. I want to respect that. How can I do that? Well, the only way that we're able to do that is to have that conversation with our loved ones. And then we have to honor their wishes. One way of doing that is with the Go Wish cards. We use that a lot here at Transitions Life Care, just to get people to talk about, just to start those conversations. At the end of the presentation, that you will have a chance to see the references. And so I have placed the reference to the Go Wish cards, which can be played online as well. There's a link to the actual cards, but then there's also a link that you can actually do it online. So advanced care planning is important. Next slide. Palliative care. So oftentimes we confuse palliative care with hospice, and palliative care can start anywhere in the journey. If you remember the trajectory of disease, palliative care can actually start in the chronic disease state. It doesn't necessarily begin in terminal illness, because palliative care understands the 4 dimensions of a person, of who we are: physical, psychological, emotional, and spiritual. And they actually come together in a medical form to address those 4 areas. Oftentimes, palliative care can help in that advanced care planning conversation. We are trained to have those conversations with individuals. So the goal of palliative care is to improve the quality of life for both the patient and the family. And the next slide, the third option is hospice. And of course, this is our former president, Jimmy Carter, who has been on hospice, I think, for about 2 years now. But hospice is when, again, I look at thinking back on the slide of the trajectory of illness, hospice typically begins at the serious illness phase, and then it continues throughout the grief. So hospice continues even after the loss of a loved one. I just want to take a few seconds just to kind of talk about this 6 months for a few seconds, because I find that people say, they're looking at that 6 months. Oh, it has to be 6 months. And that's not necessarily true. Medicare says that as we determine folks that are eligible for hospice, there is a criteria that says, can you look from a professional standpoint and looking at the trajectory of disease, looking at the functionality of the patient, because a lot of factors kind of play into the eligibility of a patient for hospice. Can you say that 6 months from now, this patient will be appropriate for hospice? Now, that's not to say that in 6 months and they not, then we just take them off. So that is not true, because the patients continually every 60 days are evaluated or reevaluated for the eligibility of hospice. So I just wanted to just kind of add that piece. Because like I said, people tend to have questions around the 6 month mark. Next slide. I want to stop for a minute. I want to pause just for a minute because we're going to move into caregiver tips. But I want to pause for a minute just to see if there's any questions regarding hospice, palliative care. What is a caregiver?
Well, we do have one question concerning hospice, and that is basically, what are some of the benefits of working with hospice?
From a patient and family perspective, they are huge. So research actually supports that when a patient is placed on hospice, their quality of life improves, and their length of stay, or when I say length of stay, I mean patients tend to live a little longer than what was indicated, or their prognosis. So when a doctor or medical provider says, oh, this patient has, I'm just using this for an example, 6 months, the research actually supports that when a patient is placed on hospice, that 6 months may or may not be true. It may be a little longer. But the other benefit of hospice is truly that support. So that support from a physical perspective, because we do want those patients as comfortable as possible looking at the 4 dimensions. So not just comfortable from pain, because we have to understand that a lot of our patients are not in pain. A lot are, but there's a lot of folks that never experience pain in hospice, but to also be able to look at the 4 dimensions of hospice and make sure that those patients are comfortable as well. And then we are there to also support that family as they are journeying through, because that family can pick up the phone at any point in time, at any time of the night, and call someone, and someone will answer that phone to support. That it?
That's all the questions we have on that specific topic right now. Yeah.
Okay. So we'll move on. So let's move into caregiving and caregiver tips. So the purpose of one of the main or 3 main purposes of caregiving is to prevent deconditioning, encourage independence, and assess the needs of the patient. When we talk about deconditioning, we know that as people age, as we progress through the trajectory of illness and that disease, continues, or people have decided to not continue treatments or whatever that case may be. We have to understand as caregivers, what is our role to delay or prevent the deconditioning. You oftentimes find this, and I keep referring back to that trajectory of illness, but you oftentimes find this more in that chronic disease, serious ill stage of the trajectory. But how do we do that? How do we encourage independence? Because one thing that most patients report during that trajectory is, I want to maintain my independence as much as possible. But that may look very differently depending on the stage of the patient, depending on the illness that they may be experiencing, depending on the structure and their environment. And I say that because there was a study done in Baltimore, Maryland. And in Baltimore, the study was about so many individuals were going to nursing home or skilled nursing facilities. And the question was that the question that they were trying to answer was, why? And what they found in that study was that people were not going to the skilled nursing facilities because they just needed it. I can't take care of myself at home, or that my disease was so, progressed that I needed 24-hour care. What they found is that the homes in Baltimore, you either go up or you go down. And so the homes were not conducive to a wheelchair or to, just coming in and out. And so since the environment was not appropriate, then most people end up going to a skilled nursing facility. So when we talk about independence, it's not just what can I do, but what does my structure and my environment, so how does that support my independence? And then thirdly, assessing the needs. So as we caregive, needs of those individuals, of our people that we are caregiving for, they change. But we have to be open to that. So that change, and we'll talk about this in our next few slides, of how do we assess that change, how do we support, and how do we encourage. Next slide. So I just want to spend a few moments on the next slide. Caregiver tips. So let's spend a little time here. So we're going to stay here for a minute, because I think there were questions around practical ways and tips to caregive. And so I'm going to start on my far left that has the shower. So one thing to maintain independence is, we found that people like to be able to still care for themselves. So people still like to be able to wash my face and wash my arms and brush my teeth and comb my hair, because this is something that we've done forever. And it speaks to my own dignity. So I know how I want my hair combed. I know how I want my face washed. And so in doing so, how do we make that safe, not only for the patient, but also for the individual that's caring for them? So if you notice on this particular slide with the chair in the tub, first of all, we need a rail. Now, these rails can be purchased anywhere: Lowe's, Home Depot, Amazon, it doesn't matter. They can be suctioned, they can be mounted, but you do need a rail. We find that rails are very useful even when it comes to, and this is just the bathroom, because, and the reason that I pulled out the bathroom, most falls occur in the bathroom. And so as caregivers, if you're caring for someone in your own home or you're caring for them in their home, we have to make sure that that bathroom is very safe. Most falls occur in the bathroom. Now, the thing about a fall is, once a patient falls, they have increased the mortality rate by 90%. and they have increased the chances of falling again by 50%. So we have to prevent falls at all costs. So I just want to just kind of point out the grab rails, and that's what they're called, grab rails. And so they need to be in showers, they need to be in bathtubs, they can be wherever they need to be, where that patient is able to grab onto that bar. The seat, they come in different ways. You can get the swivel one so the patient sits outside of the tub, and then you're able to kind of swivel them inside of the tub. With this particular setup, the patient has to be able or to, move their legs over the edge of the tub, or you're able to do that for themselves. So if you don't have anyone that doesn't have the capability of doing that, then this may not be an option. Now, we'll say if that's not an option, then getting in a shower is not an option as well. Because once they are in that shower, you may be able to get them in the shower. But what we find is at some point you have to get them out of the shower. Well, when you get them out of the shower, they're wet. And so now that increases the risk of falling. So this is a caregiver tip to the far left. In the middle, best foods for older adults. What I want to emphasize here is that as caregivers, we have to assess the food needs, the nutritional needs. As people age, as they progress through the trajectory of illness, we find that food choices change. The amount of foods change. And so the person may not want 3 meals a day. The person may not want 2 meals a day, and that is okay. They may just want cereal in the morning and a sandwich in the evening. They are good. This is what we have to remember, is that the caloric intake needs to change, because if we are not, remember, calories are in it, are energy, it's energy. So if we're not using energy, then we don't need as many calories. So if a patient is in the bed or spending most of their time in a chair, their caloric intake is going to go down. We just live in a society where we like to eat and we like to feed people, and that is okay. But as you journey through, you will find that their consumption of food may be decreased. And so we have to be aware of that. You will also find heavy foods, they don't want heavy foods. So I don't want roast beef and potatoes. I don't want chicken and rice. I don't want steak and potatoes. Just give me light foods. And that's okay. That's okay. The body gives us what we need. And so we have to be keen to that, and assess that and be cognizant to what the patient wants. To the far right, I'm going to the far right with the gentleman being repositioned. This is a biggie, because we have to be able to roll people over and reposition folks while they're in the bed, getting them up and out of the bed safely, not only again for the patient, but also for the caregivers. How do we do that? And so what this indicates is the use. Now, this is actually a roller. Now, a typical home will not use a roller, but you can use a sheet. And so what you see is she is rolling the sheet. The patient has rolled to a side, repositioned on a side. A sheet is being rolled under that patient. If the patient is able to roll back and forth, then you are able to place a sheet under them. You are able to place a moving sheet, like we call it a lift sheet if you need to move them up and down. You're able to place a underpad under them for incontinent people. You are able to place adult diapers under them just by the use of rolling it under them. So you don't have to, and once you roll one time and then they roll over the second time, the patient should not have to keep rolling back and forth. Another way of using this as well as repositioning folks is once you put, not a sheet because it's too small. But if you use, you can roll up a blanket, comforter, or you can use a pillow, if that what we have. But you can place those under the length of the body so that the patient is comfortable. And so it prevents that patient from falling back and forth. So when I want that patient on my left side, then I roll things under them, one, to make them comfortable, two, to have them to stay there. Now, the question always come up, how often do we roll them or reposition them? And the answer is always every 2 hours. Well, that's dependent on the patient, because in our hospice world, we actually do not say every 2 hours. It is what is comfortable for the patient and for the caregiver. Now, the goal is to prevent pressure ulcers or wounds, but we have to be that every 2 hour rule does not apply to everybody. It's my point. We want to reposition them as often as we can, but again, the every 2 hour is not always applicable for every situation. So just keep that in mind. The other thing I will say to that is, if a patient is sleeping and they are okay and they don't have any wounds, I will not wake a patient up every 2 hours to reposition them if I'm in the home. Under that particular picture, you find eating utensils. One is one that can be placed on the hand of an individual. You'll notice that the spoon is curved, because in patients that are living with Parkinson's disease and patients that are living with diseases that causes them to tremor or experience tremors, this is important. That spoon typically is weighted. And you can find weighted spoons, of course, online, or eating utensils, not just spoons, eating utensils, or you can make your own. So I actually have seen patients, families make their own. They just put a weight on the end of the eating utensil. We find that weight is enough that it will control some of the tremors, enough that patient can independently feed themselves. To the right of that is actually a sleeve. So the fork is inserted in the sleeve. You'll notice that the sleeve is still attached to the patient's hands. So people that cannot or have the inability to grasp or hold on or is slipping out, you can actually place the utensil inside of that sleeve. And so with their thumb, they are able to manipulate the eating utensil. So this is just another option for people that are living at home, and to keep them as independently as possible. At the bottom, we have toiletries. How do we get folks in and out of the bathroom? And so oftentimes we are used to the over the toilet device that you see in that particular picture, but I just wanted to offer that there are other ways. One can go on top of the toilet stool. It's a riser. The other one you can place over the toilet stool. Is not, enough. Again, it's the bars, so it's not so much of the toilet seat itself, but it's just the bars. I can use the toilet seat. I just need some bars to help me get up and down. Again, you will see the grab bars that we mentioned in the shower and in the tub. Again, you will see a bedpan. There are certain ways that we need to use a bedpan. All bedpans are not equal. And so I just want to understand that there's bedpans, there's different types of bedpans. And so we just have to get the one that is most comfortable for the patient that we're caring for. And lastly, to the far right, the individual who is helping with the gown. One thing that I will say is that if you're caring for someone and there's a certain side of their body that's weaker than the other one due to paralysis or just weakness, you put in that side first. Then you put in the side that is unaffected. Open shirts work very well. Then shirts or top, your shirts or sweaters that's going over the head. So ones that you can button tend to be a little better than anything that would have to go over their heads. Because once you put it over the head, then you have to manipulate the arm up to place it inside of the sleeve. When you have an open button shirt, then you're able to place that from the side. And most people have trouble lifting their arm instead of extending the arm out. So just wanted to share some practical caregiver tips for you. All right, next slide. So let's look under the hood. Let's spend a little time talking about how do we care for ourselves if we are caring for individuals. And let's look under the hood. So did I feel strained? Am I having trouble keeping my mind on what I'm doing? Do I feel just overwhelmed? Do I get upset? Am I a little edgy, a little irritable? And am I satisfied? Does my family think what I'm giving them is that satisfactory? Caregiver self-assessment. What on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your own self? Next slide. So important tips for caregivers from caregivers. So the next 8 tips that I will reference actually come from caregivers who have been through it multiple times. And so the first one is learn to communicate effectively. Communication is key. Communication needs to not only with the individual, not only with the other family members that may be caring for that individual, but also with the medical team. And I think this is important. I'm medical, so I think this is important because caregivers need to know where those patients are. When we look at the trajectory, are we at the serious phase or are we at the terminal phase? It's a big difference. That's a big difference. It's a big difference when we talk about what are the needs, the short-term needs and the long-term needs of those individuals. Because if an individual is in the serious stage, the long-term needs may be way off. But if they're in the terminal stage, what was long-term needs are now short-term needs. And caregivers need to know where they are, because as we indicated earlier, the stress, but also that financial burden. So we know that as people progress, that financial burden gets greater and greater. Second tip is take care of you. Making time for self-care. Women, for the females on the call, I think we are the least group to do this. And this is anecdotally, my experience, and not only my personal experience, but also my professional experience of seeing women serve as caregivers, but also research supports that women in general do not do well in this area of making time for self-care, particularly when it comes to caregiving. So what does that look like? And I think we have a different definition of self-care. It can literally mean get in the car and drive down the road and be by myself for 10 or 15 minutes. That can be self-care. It doesn't necessarily have to be make an appointment for a massage. But it does mean I do need to check in with myself on a day-to-day basis. Where am I emotionally? Where am I psychologically? And so, because we know that caregiving can take a toll on caregivers, so take care of yourself, however that may look for you. Take the time for you. Next slide. Acknowledge your loved ones' limitations. We got to be honest. We have to be honest with ourselves and with the loved ones of where we are. We do something here at Transitions, and it's called empathy simulation. And I did it yesterday for the new group of newly hired folks here. But we have a exercise where we have individuals Breathe in through the little, the little straws that they use for stirring your coffee, the real little ones, the narrow ones. And so we say breathe in for about 60 seconds. And then and hold that breath. And then you can see people within those 60 seconds, some of them fall off, some of them start to just sweat. I mean, it's a lot of, and not a lot of emotions occur in 60 seconds. And the purpose of that is to understand that when you are in that situation, I need someone to acknowledge the fact that I can't breathe. So I don't need you at that moment saying, now come on now, get up, come on, we got to do this, come on and get up, when I can't breathe. And so we have to acknowledge our loved ones' limitations, and we have to be honest about that. If we want them to do certain things, and I understand that, but also we have to understand where they are, and that some things they just cannot do. And it is okay. It is okay. The other one is accept help from community, family, and friends. So when people ask you for help, do not hesitate to accept it, whatever that may be, big or small, because as we journey through, help becomes critical. Help becomes very critical. You will not be a burden on others when they are asking you for help. Keep that in mind. Be realistic, and that kind of goes back to acknowledging your loved one's limitations, but also be realistic not only where that patient is, but be realistic about where we are on that trajectory. We can't say we can't say they're serious when they really are terminal. We can't say that. We can, but are we being realistic, and are we being fair to not only ourselves, but also to that individual? I will add here, be realistic to where you are as a caregiver. I just can't do it anymore. I need a break. There is something that's called respite. To the question that came earlier, I think I can't remember the exact wording of that question, but respite is available for all hospice patients. They can get it 60 days, every 60 days once they have been on service. So respite is imperative. So be realistic where you are on your own caregiver journey. Be open to new methods of care. There's always a new way, or there could be, I'm not going to use the term always, but there could be a new way of, of using things. And I will say, stay connected to the outside world. Stay connected to that outside world. Understand that the world is there for you. Stay connected to your family, your friends, and your colleagues, and get organized. So where are we with our legal documents, financial obligations? I talked about advanced care planning, wills, estates, things like that. Get all of that together during this time. So when that time comes, it decreases the anxiety and the chaos. And then lastly, I want to talk about what happens as we move forward after the loss. Next slide. This is the psychological piece of it, is after the loss of a loved one. How do we move forward? So we choose one thing to do each day that is very differently from what we've done before. Because for the last year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years, we've taken care. Our thing to do was to caregive. So let's think about something else to do. It can just start with one thing. So if I've never gone on a walk before, we walking today. Practice spending time with yourself. Remember, as a caregiver, you spent most of your time with that individual. So let's practice just spending time, if it's no more than 5 minutes, and increase that time as we go. Take things at your own pace. This is when we need to give ourselves grace. There's not a timing on anything. Do it at your own pace. This is a biggie, and this is one thing that we encourage our families to do, is write down your stories and your memories. Write them down. Oftentimes people journal during the trajectory of the illness until the loss of the individual, but we'll find that they write down the stories afterwards. Give thanks to those who have supported you. If the church or the neighbor or the friend or the job or whomever, just give thanks to those individuals. And lastly, practice prayer, meditation, and mindfulness, whatever that looks like for you. You just be connected, whether it's yourself, whether it is the environment, whatever however that speaks for you. Be in prayer and practice that, to help you move forward and to help that anxiety and that psychological effects that caregiving may have. And next slide, I think that's it. And these are our resources. And I was told that these resources will be shared with you. Again, the Go Wish card is on here. 5 questions to ask your doctor about a sudden illness, palliative care, and AARP resources. That ends my presentation for today. Are there any questions?
Sure, we do have a number of questions that came on in, but I want to let everyone know before we go into the questions that we cannot talk about insurance policies such as long-term care policies, nor can we talk about resources for funds. The main reason for the resources for funds, we don't have the subject matter expert for that. We will attempt, we being NCRGEA, will attempt to find some resources for you, but today we cannot present that information. But let's get into the questions. So first, we're going to go to the questions that were asked online in one moment. Screen has changed. What do you do when you have a loved one that's confused about who is dead and who is alive? Should you tell them the truth? Should you lie about it? Or should you divert their attention to something else?
I'll answer that several ways. It depends on where they are in the process. So I'm assuming that this is a patient that is living with Alzheimer's disease in those final stages of Alzheimer's disease. And when I say final stages, if you're familiar with the Alzheimer's diseases, it's from 6 A, B, C, D, and E, 7 A, B, C, D, and E. Once they get to the 7th stage, the inability to process, that's just part of the disease progression. So at that point, whether you tell them or not, the likelihood of them remembering is, so you can just go with it if that's where their brains are at that point. If they are early in the stage of dementia, or, now I'm talking about a person that is still able to function at some level, it is okay. I would say it is by case basis, because if that causes anxiety for that individual, then don't tell it, because then you've made the situation worse. So it's something that just has to be assessed. There's not a right or wrong answer, because individuals are different, particularly when it comes in that in that progression of disease.
Thank you very much. Just on a personal note, my mother was in the last stages, and her sister had passed 2 days, had recently passed while my mother was in the last stages. We did not tell her. We just figured that she would soon find out that answer soon enough.
Yes.
You may not be able to answer this question, maybe getting into the funds, but can a caregiver be paid? And if so, can a caregiver be paid?
From my understanding, they can, but again, I don't know the details of that. It's a lot of, red tape to kind of go through. But on a short answer, there's yes, on some level.
That is, if the caregiver is a family member.
Okay.
All right. Can a person be taken off of hospice once they've been put onto it?
Absolutely. So they are evaluated every 60 days after the 180 days of being on hospice. So Medicare allows for about 6 months for the hospice to evaluate that individual. And then every 60 days, that patient is evaluated for the criteria for hospice. So we have, I'm not going to say we have a large percentage of patients that are discharged, but we have there's, quite many. The diagnosis that is discharged from hospice more than any other diagnosis is Alzheimer's, because that diagnosis is just so long and so chronic, and it can be so quote unquote slow in the decline, because we have to be able to indicate the decline. And that doesn't mean that the patient can't come back on. They can definitely come back on, but that is our number one diagnosis for discharge.
Devon, I didn't catch it on the last slide, but is there a place people can go for local support, such as like within a county, the state of North Carolina, or even on a national basis
I'm sorry,
for the caregiver?
for
Is it sort of like not to belittle it, but sort of like a caregiver anonymous?
Yeah, I think they're now locally. I think that there are several caregiver support groups. I know Transitions has one. So transitionslifecare.org has a caregiver support group. We have those that have had patients with us, family members that were patients of transitions. We have a family advisory council for those individuals as well. But there is just an overall caregiver support group. I think Wake County has a caregiver support group. Most of the illnesses have a caregiver, support group, breast cancer support groups, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease. So it really kind of goes by locally. Now I'm only speaking locally. There's places to go within our local area for support, depending on what diagnosis it is.
And I believe you just answered this question on the reevaluation, but just reemphasize for hospice care. How long can a person remain on it, and how long, what are the transit evaluation time periods?
The evaluation time period starts 60 days after 180 days. So they have to be on for 180 days. And if they are still here with us, they have not made that transition, then that evaluation occurs every 60 days.
So now, is there a maximum time period someone?
No, as long as that patient meets the criteria of decline. Now they are assessed very well before coming on, because they have to meet a criteria. Medicare has a criteria, and I want to just put this out here because I think people have there's been a myth around what is the criteria. There is a criteria per diagnosis. So the criteria for breast cancer is different than the criteria for heart disease. So Medicare has specific diagnosis that the individual has to meet, or at least almost meet, in order to be eligible for hospice.
Going on to that, let's say you have a family member that is receiving caregiving through another family member, but you don't live near them. What can someone who is not present do to assist the caregiver and the family?
Absolutely. So one, that can just be a support, because as we talked about, caregivers report stress, emotional strain, things like that. So if no, at the minimal, be a support for the caregiver. So be that 15 minutes away, when that caregiver needs to get out of the house and they need somebody to vent to, we can be that ear. There's always financial support. We noted that $10,000 is coming out of pocket and that's on an average. So we know that it can be much more than that. And so there's that, emotional support. We know that those patients need, the financial support. We know that a lot of times those patients need, I'm just using this for an example, the insures, the diapers, the wipes, so if you're able to send those things through the mail, or I can pick them up at Walmart, or I can run by Sam's and get those, and you have purchased those wherever you are, then that, things like that are very helpful. What is the burden, just the inside burden of the house? Can I take a phone, can I take your phone bill for this month? I'm just speaking from a financial. Can I take your phone bill from this? Can I take your rent? Whatever that looks like. There's a lot of support that we can give remotely without being just hands-on physical for the patient. Can I call in Uber Eats for you on Friday so you don't have to worry about food for that day?
Folks, just to let you know, due to time limitation, we are right at our limit right now. We only have time for 2 more questions. So the next one, what skills should one expect from a caregiver through an agency? Is there a caregiver required to demonstrate the skills to show their proficiency?
No. So they don't have to. I mean, your agency should have that. If you're going through an agency, the agency should be able to provide the proficiency of that particular caregiver. If it's a skilled caregiver. Now, if you're going through an agency, they should be able to vouch for the skills of that individual. I would still add that I would actually do my own interview of the caregivers. What are your needs? So be able to identify your needs. And, when you're in that interview with that person, ask those questions. Can you do that? How do I know? You have the right to interview that person as well.
Very good. Thank you. And then the last question that we have time for today is, how do you prepare your family, especially the children, to become caregivers? In other words, that, say, the mother or the father is going to need care, and family members, how do you prepare them?
That's a hard one. First, I would start with communication, and I will start with honest communication. This is where we are, and this is what the needs are going to look like. And I would plan it out, short term, long term. But we've got to let people know where we are. Where is the loved one? Where are we on the trajectory? And what does that trajectory look like? Because people got to understand, are we here for 2 years? Are we here for a year? Are we here for 6 months? Are we only here for 2 weeks? Where am I? What is my commitment? And then what are the short-term and the long-term goals? What are your needs? Who's going to be the primary care person for that? Because then I know where I stand. What can I give? And then in addition to that, have people got to shadow, because people are coming in and they don't know. And lastly, I would say is caregiving looks very differently for everybody. So everybody is not there to shower and do the task of showering and bathing and repositioning and toileting and dressing. Somebody kind of needs to wash dishes in the home, and so we celebrate everyone's skills because it's going to take effort for everyone. That is still part of caregiving.
Juan, thank you very much. That's it for our times for questions. If you do have a question or a comment that you think of later, just reach out to Daryl Fulmer at Daryl, DERYL, at NCRGEA.com. Before we leave, we want to let you know about June's Lunch and Learn, Healthy Living for Your Brain and Body, tips from the latest Alzheimer's research. It's going to be presented by Nancy Swigert of the Alzheimer's Association, and it's going to be on June 5th from 12:30 to 1:30. Registration for that is now open. This presentation will give healthy decision-making strategies around sleep, nutrition, exercise, and cognitive and social engagement. At any age, there are lifestyle habits that we can adopt to help maintain or improve our health. And the latest research indicates that these habits may also help keep our brains healthy as we age and reduce the risk of cognitive decline and dementia. Please check your emails for links to register for this webinar. And again, if you have any questions, just reach out to us and we will we will work on getting the answers for you. That's it for today. We'd like to thank you all for joining us. And as always, NCRGEA stands ready to assist you in your retirement. Thank you very much and goodbye.